Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, and they're all going to be a little bit thinky. So if you don't like thinky episodes, maybe skip this one, but we're going to be talking about the drift of democracy and the idea about having a maximum wage. I know we're only covering two, but that's because they are subjects that are really worth diving into. The drift of democracy is going to be the main one, but I really want to explore this idea of a maximum wage. But hey, we'll get to it as we get to it. Of course, we'll end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, in this beautiful world that we live in, there are multiple democracies across the entire world that don't necessarily operate the same way that we do. But in the West, a lot of these democracies are based on more religious tenets, or at least have their roots in some of the Judeo-Christian values. And whether or not you want to agree, I mean, the church saved a lot of the history and knowledge that was passed down from ancient times and was brought back forward after the Dark Age. So obviously, I'm not trying to say that only religion is the way to have a democracy. There are plenty of democracies that operate without having a religious aspect, but to fail to acknowledge the influence that Western religion has had on our Western democracies is bad faith when trying to give an honest analysis of what's going on and where we are and where we could be going forward. So that's where our first piece comes in. Tell me what you think down in the comment section. Could our democracy survive without a religious center, or at least a moral framework that is divined from the religion that propped up the West for so long? And with that said, let's jump into the article that comes from the Imaginative Conservative. The drift of democracy is the headline. And like I said, this is going to be a little bit more of a thinky one. So I'm going to read the second paragraph and give a little bit of context as to where we're going to go with it, and then we can really dive into it. Quote, "It is not easy to fit contemporary events into a historical perspective, and we always tend to exaggerate the importance of our own time. But it is difficult to think of a period of such anxiety and uncertainty as the present. There is an awareness of the fact that civilization, both in its economic structure and its cultural outlook, is imperiled. There is a growing feeling that life has become so complex that human reason at its best can hardly guide it, and a certainty that it is hopeless to leave its destiny to the wishes of the people as expressed in the rough and ready methods of modern democracy." End quote. So let's back up. One, what do some people ascribe this uncertainty to, this trepidation among people, this idea that society is going to collapse? Well, on some sides, you're going to hear arguments about the wealth being concentrated at the top and how we have a mechanism that actively strips people of their agency, of their ability to do what they so please with their time and their energy, because there's a system set up to create basically a slave market out of them, that they can only work for their wages and they are being exploited by the people at the top. There are others who argue that without a moral foundation and a central moral thesis as to what is right and wrong and what needs to be protected and what is supposed to be banned, criminalized, that will lead to a degradation of the society. And they would argue that we live in such a relativistic time that people create their own moral schemes, their own moral frameworks, and then try to imply or state that the way they see things is good enough for them, and it doesn't necessarily have to hold across an entire society. Then you could see another argument about late-stage capitalism that doesn't necessarily have to do with the rich being empowered, but rather the way that the mechanisms of our market specifically are meant to capture wealth rather than generate and create it. We are de-emphasizing the worker, the innovator, the creator, the entrepreneur, the engineer, and we're actually worried more about how we shuffle that money around between one another. And you see this with trading algorithms that operate in milliseconds, and they only make maybe 2, 3, maybe 50 cents on each stock that they're selling, but because they're doing it in such large sizes and they're able to predict to some degree the volatility of the market, they make huge profits off of these millisecond trades that aren't necessarily based on the fundamentals of companies anymore, meaning that the capital is not flowing to the companies that are actually solid fundamentally, but rather the algorithms are trained to take advantage of the volatility within the market and strip wealth away from companies that may be fundamentally sound, but are not necessarily the reason, or they are fundamentally sound, but that's not the reason that people are trying to actually get into them. It's rather they see an opportunity simply to make money, aka stripping wealth. There are lots of different theories as to why this is, but there's one that is pernicious. There's one that has come forward, and I would say it's not necessarily new. The idea of the people not being able to rule themselves and not being able to properly understand the functionings of their government and their civic duty, or any manifestation of basically the people can't govern themselves. We've seen two strands of this that have been at play for quite some time. And one of them has been more prominent, which is we need to trust not necessarily the elite, but the chosen few who are smarter, the people who have a better understanding. We need to simply put our faith and our trust into a group of people who know better than we do, that know better for us, or they operate for the betterment of us. Even though sometimes that doesn't appear to be true, but that's how the argument goes. It's taking power away from the people and placing it in the hands of a few. You could say it's an oligarchy. I wouldn't say it's that concentrated, but you could call it a bureaucratic state. And this has been relatively accepted based on regulatory agencies having such deference in how they go about their actions and how they're able to put rules into place that govern how companies, people interact. But you've also seen a strain of monarchy / centralized power, strongman-ish mentalities come out from a different part of the culture more recently, saying that we need to reaffirm that people don't necessarily understand the best course of action for them, and we have to put somebody in place that does. And I've seen multiple strands of this. It's very rare. And what I mean by that is I'm not saying it's every 100 person that I've interacted with. It's not every 200 people, every 1 in 200 people. It's probably like every 1 in 500 people that I've interacted with that I've seen a few monarchists out there in the system. And don't get me wrong, they do make some interesting arguments that you need to at least take into account. But at the core, at the very center of it, is they do not trust people to govern themselves, to have their best interest at heart. And I've run into people who are even more practical in that assumption, and not necessarily saying that we need monarchists, but that we need leaders and guiders. And to some degree, I understand why we have a representative republic rather than a pure democracy. It's meant to mitigate the people who don't necessarily pay attention to every single aspect of foreign policy, of the trade deals, of where a certain exemption that they could, in theory, vote on in their tax policies in a pure democracy, how that actually would affect people. There need to be informed people who have some understanding of how either the game is played or how these different policies will have an impact on people. I understand that to some degree, and that's why a republic, rather than a pure democracy, is what we have. But at one point you do take it too far and you become very, very paternalistic when you're implying that people are too dumb to understand what is good for them. Just because they don't understand how the policy will play out fully doesn't mean they don't understand what's good for them. If you tell them the end goal and you tell them the extra repercussions of said policy and how it have to be implemented, then yes, they can make those decisions for themselves, at least for the most part. Don't get me wrong, I have hope in people. I'm also cynical of people. I do believe that people have a worse nature. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are always not able to think for themselves, but rather very often people won't necessarily act in the best interest of other people in the society as well, but rather will only seek their own self-interest. But that's a complicated theory for another day. But this is what this article is trying to get at. It's trying to get at these fundamental struggles at the core of our democracy in an age where we have stepped away from so many of the traditions that have brought us here, and what this is going to bring in the future, especially because the civilization, as it outlines, can feel it. There is angst, there is cynicism, there is deep questioning of all the systems that are in place. That's how you get a monarchist movement. That's how you get an eat the rich movement. They, in the past, have been able to I don't want to say coexist, but the elites in the middle class and the lower class have been able to coexist, maybe because of the stubbornness of the upper classes to, I don't know, maybe play the game a little bit more, pretend that they actually care. Maybe it's because the lower classes didn't feel as disenfranchised, or maybe it's because there is a rot at the center of the system where no longer do those people at the top actually who are able, and I'm going to make a vast generalization here, but in theory, the people at the top that have time to worry about some of these more nuanced governing things, they no longer have a sense of duty that comes along with that wealth and that privilege in order to help the people below them. And maybe as that starts to disintegrate, whether it's because of the downfall of religion, whether it's because there is no longer an ethic, a shared morality, there's so many different reasons, but you can definitely see that the tension has built more and more. And there are plenty of other reasons that we can list, but just because we can't necessarily diagnose what caused the tension to rise, that doesn't mean we can't point out that the tension is rising. And it's not just between left and right. It's not just between upper class, middle class, lower class. There are substratas of the population that are not necessarily at each other's throats, but are definitely on edge when discussing anything, because it feels as though we have put ourselves into so many different boxes and we no longer have a shared identity. Now, that is a more nuanced approach to what this article is saying. Let's actually give the article a little bit of time to breathe. You know, it's a nice little bottle of wine. You pop it open, you gotta let it breathe a little bit. So let's give the author some time to really go in. Quote, despite it all, it is not a foolish question to ask whether man has been happier by these achievements. So it's talking about after the Industrial Revolution. Quote, those whose dreams have come true beyond their fondest hopes never seem to have realized that there is no simple recipe for happiness. They have never learned, as many of our social reformers have not learned, the simplest psychological and ethical reason that pleasure and happiness are not the same. It seems to be an awful truth that only one factor in the conquest of happiness has been realized by modern progress, and that is the diminution of physical suffrage. It is indeed a fine achievement, and yet experience tells us how comparatively unimportant it is, for very great happiness has come through suffering. Now, this is an interesting point. Are we sitting on our laps of luxury and just eating it all up and not necessarily recognizing that the struggle is what is important? Now, what do I mean by that? Could you make an argument that the people at the top of society who are not necessarily doing their duty to the people at the bottom of society, are they just sitting in their lap of luxury and not recognizing the struggle and the pains that their family had to go through, because a lot of wealth is being inherited, but also even the wealth that they had to generate themselves and the suffering that they had to go through? Think of the Jeff Bezoses, think of the Elon Musk. Whether you like Elon Musk or not, he's suffered a lot in order to get where he is. The Emerald Myth is a lie. Jeff Bezos built himself up. He's a ruthless man. He has suffered a lot of loss in his life in order to get exactly where he is. So my question to you is that the suffering that they mentioned, or is there also the possibility that us in the, I don't want to say the bottom strata, but in the lower strata of the society, are we forgetting that we can't simply ask and receive just because we feel that it's necessary? Have we forgotten that in order to get to the places we want to be, in order to achieve that happiness, that prosperity, to gain that pride in ourselves, we have to suffer, we have to give up, we have to lose in order to become better? Are we just content? Are we sitting on our laurels? Are we sitting fat and happy? And for those of you who are saying, well, I don't make that much, I only have a small apartment, I may not even have a house, maybe I'm renting from here to there, whatever it may be, I'll be honest, even if you're a person who lives on the street nowadays, and I'm not trying to demean what the terrible lives that people are forced into on the streets, but even the people that live on the streets have it better than some of the poorest in the times of the Romans. Now, does that mean that it's okay? Not necessarily. But my point being that we live in a time that has been crafted by people who have put in hard work, and there's still people putting in hard work, and I'm sure you are too, but we live in a place and a time that has been crafted by so much suffering that has come before us, and sometimes we lose perspective. Sometimes we look around us and we take it for granted. Sometimes you do not understand what was given up by your forefathers, by my forefathers, by everybody's forefathers in order to get us where we are. So not only is it important to understand the suffering that came before us, but also remember that suffering is actually a crucial part of our existence. Whether you want to claim it's a Buddhist point of view, whether you want to claim it's a Christian point of view, if you want to claim that it is a Taoist point of view, a Taoist point of view, Zoroastrianism, whatever point of view you want to claim. It could be non-religious. It could just be a fundamental teaching of Confucius. But the point being that forgetting that suffering is necessary and that we cannot go through life without it, and that in actually avoiding it, sometimes we avoid growth, we avoid the pain that will shock us into the right direction. All of these things come together. All of these different lessons that I've been throwing out there about suffering come together to prove to us that in order to progress, we have to suffer. Whether we look at the past and we understand it, or whether we understand just the simple reality of how we operate as human beings and understanding the fundamental nature of the world we live in. Guess what? A starfish, in order to get a fresh limb, let's be clear, the cells reproduce on a small level, but sometimes it's got to rip off that arm. In order to get out of a trap that has one arm caught, sometimes the arm has to rip off and has to grow it back out, and that arm comes back a little bit stronger, okay? We have to take on all of those flaws from our past. We have to try to attack them in going at any of your flaws, any of your mistakes, and trying to address them is mental suffering on its own. Acknowledging that you are a weak person, that you need to take XYZ task on, that's going to be anguish for you mentally. Acknowledging that you are going to have to put yourself in hard situations that you don't necessarily enjoy, that's suffering, but maybe you come out of it a little bit stronger. And I feel like the article is making a point here, which is on top of everything else that I mentioned before, we have lost perspective. We are sitting on the laurels of a wealthy society and expecting to not have to feel the pain that everybody else before us experienced. And that's fair. They worked hard, so we don't necessarily have to work as hard. But if we want the same experience for our children, for the next generation, the one that comes after that, guess what? We have to suffer in order to make it better for them. And I don't think perfection is possible, but getting closer to it is going to require a lot of suffering going forward. And pretending as though we can stall and stay where we are, and like I said a million times, sit on our laurels as a society, as a species, it is going to get us nowhere, and it is only going to make the lessons harder for the next generation. So this is the point that I was getting at, which is for our democracy to work, for our democracy to actually thrive, we have to acknowledge all the suffering that has come before, all the suffering that has been given, not just that has happened, but has been given in order to ensure that our democracy operates in the way that it does. All the sacrifices that people make in order to properly represent you, to fight for their rights in this system. All of them. Every single bit of suffering that has gone into building the current democracy/republic that we have, we cannot take this for granted. And when you do, when you take it for granted and you sit in your laurels and you do not respect the system, you do not aid the system, you try to constantly criticize the system and simply take it down rather than propose solutions and honor what it stands for and what it should be, even while you're trying to retailor it to what you want it to be, you are going to have too many people who are deeply cynical about the state of our nation. You're going to have too many people who believe that people do not understand their duty and their obligation to the people around them and to the society that they live in, and then they will propose tools that take it out of the hands of the people who sit on their laurels rather than actively participate. This is what is happening. All these proposals about putting the power in centralized hands, whether or not you agree with them, and trust me, I have many issues with them. I don't like centralized power, whether it be a single authority or whether it be an oligarchy. But these are actually their prescriptions, their cures to the problem. They see the problem of the rot, of the people not necessarily engaging, not caring, being easily manipulated, not giving any flying word I will not say on this podcast. And they're trying to propose a way out where it is easier to have one person or a group of people who is dedicated to this goal rather than leaving it in the hands of multiple people. But no, because we, as a people, we have to take on the responsibility to save our democracy. We have to take on the responsibility to keep it thriving, to ensure that everybody is educated, that everybody is participating, that people are well informed, that there is a high moral standard for everybody else. Guess what? It is hard. It sucks when you call out other people and you try to call them on their baloney, and they may be making a statement that you agree with on some level, but they're saying it in a way that is absolutely obtuse. Maybe they're doing something that you don't like, and you don't necessarily want to call them out because it makes you uncomfortable. You have to suffer just a little bit in order to uphold those rules throughout the rest of our society. And when we all take agency, when we all acknowledge that we have a part to play in this democracy and that we can build it up, and it's going to take a little bit of extra work from all of us, a little bit of extra suffering. And work is not inherently suffering, but you do have to give things up when you work. You have to give up a little bit of your extra energy. You have to give up a little bit of your mental time in general, or your mental energy. If we all acknowledge that we're going to have to do this, maybe we will be worthy of the responsibilities that we have been given. And maybe we can actually prevent these people who believe they are more high-minded, or they believe they understand the system better and that they can do a better job if the power was centralized around them or given to somebody that they trust, whether it be bureaucrats, a monarch, so on and so forth. Maybe we can actually prove to them that we deserve our democracy by understanding our duty, and understanding that to live up to that duty, to actually enact that duty, is going to take a little bit of suffering. Like I said, this is a really thinky one today. Maybe I'm totally wrong, and there are probably lots of holes that you can find. I think overall I've made a pretty coherent point with a few rambles in between there. Please dissect it if you want. Maybe I have a messed up view of human existence, and that is always possible. Maybe you don't agree. Throw it down in the comment section, because I'd love to hear what everybody has to say, because it is a responsibility of all of us to participate. If you're listening to this, you're already participating more than the average person, because either you found this and you thought it was interesting and you actually want to be more involved, or you're a person that listens on the regular and you know that we talk about crucial things, sometimes not the most important things in the world, but still crucial things, to make sure that everybody is informed going throughout this beautiful process we call self-governance. So, with that said, let's jump into our second article that comes from Counterpunch. Headline reads, "There are minimum wages. Why not a maximum wage?" So, the thing is, this article is actually very short. It is literally a paragraph. I will read you the entire paragraph, but there is more to it behind the paywall, of course. Why don't we have a maximum wage? Asking that question is another way of asking why some people can rake in millions while others struggle to earn enough to eat. A maximum wage might be one way to tamp down on some of the massive inequality that exists around the world, the political conditions for and because the rest of it is behind a paywall, I have no problem quoting that entire first paragraph and displaying it to you, because you could go find it yourself and not necessarily have to pay anything. So I feel as though it's a fair use of the material. So why? Honestly, I'm treating this more of as a prompt to have a discussion about maximum wage than to actually criticize the article itself, because I'm not going behind the paywall of Counterpunch. No offense to you, Counterpunch. Great organization. I don't agree with a lot of your points, but I still love that you're doing some hard-hitting stuff and you're trying to expose what you believe is the corruption and the problems and the rot within our society. And if you have that vocation, go for it. So why not a maximum wage? Well, I'm against a maximum wage. Here's why. Can you cap the potential of a person? Well, let's just put it there. Is there a absolute ceiling to the potential of any one person? Are you telling me that when I am 80 years old, that you're capped out? You can't learn anymore. You can't have any more skills. There's no more value that you can bring than what you've brought in the past. I do not believe that is the case. Now, you could make an argument about saying you can't necessarily make money this way or that way. I think most of those are wrong. If you want to do it in stock options, great. If you want to do it in raw billables that gets taxed, great. But why is saying that there is an absolute maximum on what people can earn such a problem for me? Because we are creatures that are constantly learning, evolving. Like I said, you always bring a new skill set to the table. You're always synthesizing information. Every single book you read, you are going to learn a small thing from it. It could be, even if it's fantasy, you could learn things about the human that are fundamental to human nature that resonate with you reading that story that you didn't necessarily understand before. If it's a motivational book, you can learn tips and tricks that you can synthesize with other information and actually help build better habits when you read a biography about one of the richest men in the world and what he went through throughout his time. Whether it be real life experiences, the way that you interact with people, maybe you say something differently to somebody on a given day and you actually learn that it's more effective in persuading them and that it actually brings them more happiness, which can make you a better marketer. You bring those extra skills along with your engineer. My point being that we are always growing, we are always becoming better. So to put a maximum on what people can earn is to say that you can never have more value added to a company than this set amount. It is quite literally saying that your capabilities are finite. And of course, if you don't want to necessarily go from the point of view that I'm making it more philosophical than it needs to be. You could be saying, well, Alex, hey, you're going out here and you're saying that this is actually making a philosophical point about what they believe about human beings, and you don't agree with that. Fair enough. Why do you not want to put a maximum wage on people from an economic point of view? It's the same thing as creating a price ceiling. You are going to artificially deflate the value of people that are operating within the market. And say the CEO can only make a certain percentage, you're going to see ripple-on effects down throughout the economy. Maybe you're going to see CEOs go to other countries. They're going to change their location that they live so that they can't necessarily be affected by this maximum wage. You're going to create an outflow of people. And we do not want to lose our brightest minds. We do not want to create a system where they're capped out from being higher earners here in America and then go somewhere else and be higher earners there. So, hey, let's say that we create an international tax system like the Biden administration is trying to do on the corporate level so that people can't evade taxes by going to other places. First off, not all countries around the world are going to adhere to that because guess what? If there is one place that does not adhere to the corporate tax limit, then it's just like Delaware, how they have lower corporate taxes. Everybody's going to go to that place like Delaware and set up their base there so that they can avoid it. And guess what? That one country that does it gets a lot of extra inflow of money and taxes because even though their tax rate isn't as high as everywhere else, it is still high enough that they get a little bit of money for it. Maybe you have a corruption system there, which could be shut down, but also the international order of things. Nations still have enough sovereignty that a true international order on a true international control system on taxes and wages would not necessarily work. But I think, though, I explained why the economic argument is also not bad. I think the philosophical one is still more important. You are telling people that you are only this valuable. You are indicating to them that they cannot progress beyond this point. You are telling people that they don't matter beyond that certain dollar value, that is their maximum value. I don't believe that you can put a price on human life. I don't believe you can put a price on human experience. I do not believe that humans simply get to their maximum and they stop. Whether it be, like I said, synthesizing new information, creating new techniques, evolving, changing, you can't simply say that you will always be worth this amount. Your labor is only this much. And the interesting thing is that the maximum wage is an argument to even the scales. It is an argument to create more equality. And yet, it actually is based in this idea that human beings can only be worth a certain amount. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to cap human potential. I do not want to say that you cannot make me less valuable than anybody else simply by putting a cap of money on it. Because there are more things that I can bring to the table that should increase my value, but if there's a maximum wage, maybe you don't pursue anymore. Maybe you're okay with stagnation. Maybe you're okay with not necessarily moving forward. And you may say that's a little bit petty. Maybe you should do it for other reasons than money. But money is a great proxy for understanding what your worth is, but also understanding what progress is. If you make more money, in theory, you are doing something more valuable. It gives purpose. It is actually a stand-in for purpose. Because if you earn more money, like I said, in theory, in theory, you add more value to people's lives. And when you add more value to people's lives, sorry, I got them mixed up there, then you bring, if not more happiness, at least a sense of respect, honor, which can be a vocation on its own. People want to be respected, and money is simply a mechanism by which we measure that respect. So, do you really want to cap how much respect we can give to people? I don't know. And let's be clear, I did make a few base arguments and a few base substitutions there. I'm sure you could rip that one apart if you want. Please go ahead and we can discuss it further, because this rant was really off the top of the head as I got to the back half of it. So I give myself a little bit of latitude to explain further, evaluate, reevaluate, and really address any comments that come in, because I'm sure there are people that would totally disagree with me. So with that said, let's jump to our daily delight. This one comes from outdoors.com. Sound on. Howling pack of wolves crashes cabin getaway. And this video is absolutely hilarious. There's a whole bunch of them just sitting outside the window. They're full on howling. This one couple got away from the United States. They went to Canada for a vacay, and then they get disturbed in the middle of the night by these wolves. I mean, it just shows that nature is unrelenting, and also nature can be adorable. Just don't go outside and open the door and the wolves, don't give them free food, and you won't have to worry about anything. But if you want to go check out this video, you want to see any of the articles that we talked about today, they're all in the link in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter tirade, which is totally off the top of the head, off the top of the dome, random thoughts, not necessarily curated stories that are thought-provoking, or like our international segments that come out on Tuesday and Thursday over here on the RSS feed and the YouTube channel. But if you want to listen to the Twitter tirade, that comes out on Tuesdays and Thursdays over at the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.